To be alive is to ask questions. Most are simple and involve nothing more than getting through the day. Some are bigger and shape our identities. But at the heart of every human being are three questions, and these define our humanity. Why do I suffer? How should I live? And what is it all for? These questions are common to all peoples and all cultures throughout all time. They follow us through life and cannot be suppressed, ignored, or laughed away. Sooner or later, these questions confront each one of us. Our own inner being demands an answer to them. Join us this semester as we hear what the Bible has to say about life's greatest questions and how they point us to a God who brings purpose to our pain, wisdom to our ways, and meaning to the measure of our days.
Hey brothers and sisters, welcome back to another evening of Solid Ground. We're glad to have you here, and we're going to continue on with life's greatest questions. You know, these questions, when we encounter them, when we face them, especially in this current age, this current global situation, they challenge us. They cause us to think. They cause us to reconsider our lives and what our lives are really for. And so in this current age, you know, this past year, the year 2020 has been full of turmoil, full of challenges and things that have happened to us. Many of us have been weakened and wounded. The norms of our church community has been lost, and we're still trying to recover it today. And also, the normal rhythms that we're used to, whether it's sports, activities, hanging out with your friends and family, it's been lost. It's been disrupted. And so we need to realize this current age, a lot of people, and even us, are still suffering. God is allowing suffering among His people today. But we see in the Bible there are two responses to suffering, right? When we come to these sufferings, when these sufferings come to us and we encounter them and we have to face them, how do we respond? Do we respond in a way that aligns with God's purpose that we saw the past few weeks? Or do we respond in a way that hinders, frustrates God in what He's doing and what He's after, right? And so, you know, in this current situation, many of us have lost our loved ones, or nearly lost our loved ones. And so I'd just like to help you, fellowship with you all, just to see in the Bible, just to open up the Bible to you and see the two responses of suffering to man. And so we can look into two particular men. We see Job in the Old Testament and Paul in the New Testament, and they're kind of similar. They're both very perfect, upright. Job feared God, you can see in the beginning of his book, and turned away from evil, and he was a man full of integrity. While Paul, before his conversion, before he met the Lord on the way to Damascus, he was considered a top-notch Jew, right? Circumcised on the 8th day, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to righteousness, which is in the law, blameless. That's what he described himself as. And so these two men have a very similar upbringing. They were both proud in themselves, both righteous in their own self. And so we want to see what God did to them, what kind of sufferings He placed upon them, and then we'll see how each one responded. So let's look at Job's response really quickly. So Job's response, you know, we got to kind of consider what kind of sufferings he went through. What kind of sufferings did God bring him? We saw in the last week that Satan was allowed by God to inflict suffering on him. And so we saw that these servants came up to him one by one after another. And we saw that the Sabaeans took away all his yoke of oxen and all his donkeys. He had 500 oxen, 500 female donkeys, and they were all taken away. That was the first thing. Second, apparently the fire of God burned up his 7,000 sheep. Okay, that's crazy. Okay, then the Chaldeans, another tribe, took away his 300 camels. And finally, through a whirlwind or tornado, he lost all his sons and daughters, all 7 of them. And even then, there was one more thing. Personally, he was inflicted with boils from head to toe. It was a severe, painful experience for Job. And because Job did not see the reason for all of this, did not see the reason why God tried to put suffering upon him, that these sufferings befell upon him, he was disturbed, perplexed, and entangled to the uttermost. He had no idea what was going on. He couldn't imagine why this was happening to him. He was righteous, he considered himself upright, and he was perfect in himself. And so his concept, his view was, why is this happening to me? Why could these things that God is allowing happen to me? I just lost all my possessions, and I lost all my children, my family. And now my body is painful with boils. Why does this happen to him? And so it was easy for him to be perfect, upright, full of integrity, full of uprightness before all these things happen. It's easy to speak well of God, to do good things when things are going your way. But we see what happens when things aren't going our way. The real Job came out. The real Job came out. And so we see in Job 3:1, the first verse under Job's response. After all this had happened, after this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. Immediately you just saw right there all the things that he had, all the things of his integrity, his perfection, his uprightness. He became bankrupt. They were completely lacking in him. He tried to hold it. He tried to keep it in. He tried to express it. But at that moment, in Job 3:1, he began to curse the day of his birth. And so you could see all of these things that filled him up. His perfection, all of these things. They were just a mask, a cloak, a facade, right? And so we realize that the environment always exposes what we really are, right? It's not a matter of Job was just inwardly a bad person. We are all like this. The environment always exposes what we really are. Whether you're expecting it, whether you are anticipating it or not, the environment will always come and expose us what we really are. And so Job was just dwelling on his excellent past. He was sighing over his miserable present, and he held fast. He held fast insistently. And even you can see in the next 30 or so chapters, he continued to boast of his uprightness, his righteousness, his integrity, and perfection. He simply would not let it go. Right? He was so full of himself and his natural man and his self. And though he cursed and cursed and cursed, he still believed he was a perfect and righteous man. He still couldn't understand why God was doing this to him. So the next verse comes in Job 10:1. My soul loathes my own life. I will let my complaint have free course in me. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. Wow. What kind of righteous, upright man would say this? He still believed after saying this that he was righteous and upright. But he will let all these complaints, he was darkened. He did not see, the light was not shining on him. He was darkened by his past success and his attainments of the natural being, right? He became content with what he had become, that he did not realize what God was really after, right? What God is after, we saw this a few weeks ago, what God is after in us is that we would contain him, be filled with him, and express him. God wants to come into man and dispense himself into man so that he can be expressed through man. Job did not realize this. Job saw something completely different. He was dwelling on the fact that that bad things only happen to bad people, right? If he was righteous, upright, these things shouldn't happen to him. But we realize in Job's situation, he could not disregard these things. He could not uphold his own righteousness. Instead, he let the complaint have free course in him, and he spoke in the bitterness of his soul. And so finally, in Job 17:1, my spirit is broken, my days are extinct, the graveyard is ready for me. Okay, this guy, this man Job, this guy, he's ready to die. He prefers at this point to just die. He doesn't want any more of the sufferings. He doesn't even care what God has for him anymore. At this point, he just wants to die. He just wants to give up on his own life. And he never saw that. God's consuming, God's stripping, God's tearing down, God's appointed suffering to man was that he would be exhausted, right? That all of his things that he had held on to would slowly be exhausted, where that eventually he would be emptied so that he could be filled and gain God. But he didn't see that. So that in Job 17:1, he's even saying that his spirit is broken and the graveyard is ready for me. We can laugh at Job, we can talk bad about Job, but really this has happened to all of us, right? Has this ever happened to you? Whenever a family emergency comes up, an argument comes up, your car breaks down for some reason, you maybe lose a job, you lose an important relationship. Has this ever happened to you? Has these things, these unknown sufferings, you're doing so well in your Christian life, you're advancing, you're pursuing, you're growing, and all of a sudden, this thing comes in. The suffering comes in. It happened to me. Happened to me when I was a senior year in college, right? It was right before a spring break, March of 2016, and my car broke down. Everything was going well. I was in cloud nine. I was floating in the heavens. I was enjoying and pursuing the Lord, and then all of a sudden, my car breaks down. I wish I could say I had a different response than Job, but it really was the case where I just could not comprehend, could not understand why my car broke down. Sorry, I keep talking about my car, but anyways, the situation is we can have these responses, these horrible responses that frustrate and hinder God's purpose, right? If we don't see, if we don't have a higher view, if we don't have a higher view or vision of His economy, His purpose, His plan, these responses will seem very normal to us, will seem very typical. And you can see it throughout the entire humanity, right? These sufferings, all they do is complain, they're bitter. And we need to realize that in these situations, we need to jump higher. We need to see higher, go higher in our view, in our vision of God's purpose and how we respond to suffering. Okay, so now we're going to take a 2,000-year leap from the time of Job to the New Testament. So 2,000 years have happened now, and we're going to have to take a look at Paul. And Paul has a completely different response. His view is different, his vision is different, his supply is different, and the people that surround him are different, right? Completely new situation, but still, there's still the matter of suffering, right? Okay, so we have Paul suffering. We see that this is kind of relayed in 2 Corinthians 11. He's whipped 5 times. He's beaten with rods 3 times. He's stoned once. He's shipwrecked 4 times. Once in his shipwreck, he's floating out on like a piece of wood day and night. He also has to constantly watch his back because he's in danger of the Jews, the Gentiles, the false brothers, everybody. Okay, everybody is out there to get him. And then also he says that sometimes he doesn't have enough food, not enough clothing, and even he says there's a thorn in his flesh. There's a thorn in his flesh, and says that, and it's most likely because his eyesight is getting poor and almost blind, right? And eventually, at the end of his ministry, he even declares in 2 Timothy, all the believers have left me. All have left me. Okay, this is the story of Paul. Paul is, you could say, is the top apostle. He's the one bringing man to God, God to man. He's the one raising up churches, saving thousands. You would expect this man, Paul, would be free of suffering because he's doing so much for God, doing so well for God. God is growing, God is expanding, God is multiplying on the face of the earth. But yet, these things are still happening to Paul because God is not really after what Paul is doing. God is after with who he is, right? And so, the first response that we see gives us a little glimpse, or actually a big glimpse, of what he sees in these sufferings, right? So 2 Corinthians 4:16 through 17, it's right after Paul's response. Therefore, we do not lose heart. We do not lose heart. But though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. For our momentary lightness of affliction works out for us more and more surpassingly an eternal weight of glory. Okay, Job never utters this once. Never even comes close to this. But here we see with Paul, the Apostle Paul, his response to suffering. He sees his afflictions, his suffering, his whippings, his stoning, his being beaten with rods, he's being shipwrecked, all these things. Momentary lightness of affliction. They're featherweight to him. They're nothing to him. In fact, he welcomes them. He welcomes these sufferings. He welcomes these afflictions. Why? Because he has an eternal view. He has God's purpose aligned with him. And he sees that this will work out for him. This is going to end up a more and more surpassingly an eternal weight of glory. It's not momentary. It's not light. It's eternal. It's weighty. It's full of glory. That's what Paul has. This is what his view is. This is what he looks at when he sees afflictions coming his way. Instead of running away from it, instead of preparing to curse his situation or curse God, he is welcoming all the sufferings. Because in his mind, in his view, he sees that these sufferings are for eternal, weighty, and glory. Eternal weight of glory. And that's what he saw. He saw that was the end result. Everything he passed through from the beginning of his conversion to the end, when he's stuck in prison. That's what he saw. He saw the eternal weight of glory. And so we come to the next verse, which is awesome. It's in Philippians 1:19 through 21. And it says, "For me, this will turn out to salvation through your petition and the bountiful supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, according to my earnest expectation and hope." My earnest expectation and hope. That in nothing, I will be put to shame, but with all boldness, as always, even now, Christ will be magnified in my body, whether through life or through death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Okay, these three verses have so much to unpack. You could share a whole message on this, but we really need to see what Paul was looking at, or what Paul's response was, even in prison. Right? Philippians is written while this man, this Apostle Paul, is in prison, in a Roman prison. It's not a house arrest. It's just time out. This is a Roman prison with rat infested, with the soldiers and the centurions that hate you, that are trying to beat you up, and there's Jews outside the prison that are trying to kill him. All these things are happening to him. This is the Apostle Paul. Let me just rewind a little bit. This is the Apostle Paul who travels across Europe and a little bit of Asia to share the gospel, to preach the word, to raise up churches, to build up and edify the saints. You would think he's treated a little bit better. Okay, look at this. Okay, so he's he's in prison. He's stuck in prison. Somehow he got in prison. And so, what do you think your response would be? You're doing a great work for God. You're doing an awesome work. You see miracles happen right in front of your eyes. You're watching saints grow. You're watching them be built up together. You're fulfilling God's eternal purpose. And yet, God allows suffering to be that he's placed in prison. He's placed in prison. So, he was responsible for all these things. Now he's confined in a Roman prison. Surely there's something to curse about. Surely there's something to murmur about. Surely you should have some complaint and bitterness in your soul about it. But Philippians, if you read it, I encourage you to read it, you'll find rejoicing, joy. All these words that shouldn't be synonymous with being stuck in a prison. This is the man that just saw God's eternal purpose in a full way. Right? Since the day he was converted, he was always under God's consuming, God's stripping, God's tearing and breaking down. But he always knew he was a prisoner in the Lord. And so his earnest expectation, we're going to go back to the verse, his earnest expectation, hope, that means he was eager to do this. He was looking forward to do this. He wasn't backing out, shrieking back about it. He was looking forward to expressing, not only expressing Christ, but magnifying Christ. Right? It's one thing to express Christ. It's another thing to magnify Christ. Magnify Christ means you make Christ bigger than who he is already. I don't know how that's possible, but he magnifies Christ in that terrible situation. And he says with all boldness, as always, he's always doing this. He's always looking in his sufferings to magnify Christ. And so he would not be put to shame. He would, in no situation, in nothing, he'd be put to shame. But he would allow Christ to be magnified in his body. For to him to live is Christ. And so we see with Job, there's no vision, no view of God's eternal purpose, no understanding of why he went through these things. With Paul, it's entirely different. We see that he sees God's purpose. He sees that God is working to exhaust him, to empty him out of all that he has, all that he has attained and obtained, so that he could gain more God. God could gain more ground in him. Okay, so this is Job. We saw Job's response. We saw Paul's response. So we're going to take a look at our response. So we're going to take another 2,000-year leap to 2021, right? In the current global situation, there's really countless suffering among all kinds of people. The U.S. is approaching 500,000 deaths in COVID. The vaccine is out, but we're still losing people every single day. The social injustice that happens, that ravages our country. Unbeknownst to us, it has affected us more ways than one. The division that happens within us, whether we want to get the vaccine or not, whether we support this party or that party. There's been divisions among us, even amongst our friends and even our family, that has caused suffering within us. And so, with this point, our response, I would like to help you to see a step-by-step experience of how to respond to the Lord. We've seen Job's response. We don't even want to talk about it anymore. We've seen Paul's response. He gives us a clear view of God's purpose. And now we want to kind of dive down a little bit, get a little practical, and see what it looks like to be in our response. Okay, Isaiah 57:15 says, I will dwell in the high and the holy place. This is God talking, Jehovah talking. And with the contrite and lowly in spirit, to revive the spirit of the lowly, and to receive the heart of the contrite. When we're going through suffering, when we're passing through things, when things just don't look right to us, we need to come to our spirit. There, God is dwelling in us. We have the indwelling Christ in our spirit, and He's there to revive the spirit of the lowly. We're not here to, we're not going to our spirit knowing something, having something, ready to complain to God. We just come to God, spirit of humility, in a lowly way, and just ask Him, what is your will in this situation? What is going on in my situation? How can you do this, and what can I gain in this situation? What can happen to me? How can I cooperate? You just spend time with the Lord in His presence. Just ask Him in a very sincere and genuine way, and you'll see that this coming to the Lord in our spirit is the only way to respond to the suffering, right? That's our first step, and everything from our spirit will issue forth. Philippians 4:4 says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. This is really the true test and whether we have really, in a genuine way, have come to our Spirit. In the midst of our situation, in our suffering, in all the affliction that's going on in our lives, can we rejoice? I'm not talking about cheering up and down, jumping up and down on a trampoline, doing backflips. But inwardly, your soul is rejoicing. It's happy. You're well pleased because the Lord is doing something marvelous in you. And so, if we can come to our Spirit and exercise our Spirit in a humble and lowly way, what will issue out, what you will see when this happens, is that you will be full of rejoicing. Full of rejoicing. Okay, 2 Corinthians 4:10. Always a bearing about in the body, the putting to death of Jesus, that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our body. Always bearing about. This was Paul's experience. This is every Christian's experience, or should be experience. Always bearing about in the body, the putting to death of Jesus, that the life of Jesus would be manifested in our body. You know, in this suffering, in this age, in this year 2021 that we're in now, a lot of suffering is still happening. Many of us, I even had to confess, that I was hoping that this suffering would end, and then I could put God back on the list. God back on my to-do list. Put God first. It's hard to pursue God when all these things are swirling and whirling around you. And so we need to realize, actually, that suffering is inevitable. Suffering is always going to happen in our lives, whether it comes through a global pandemic, a family loss, a friends, or just something material, anything. Anything can come to you as suffering. What Paul did, what we need to do, is to always bear it in our body, the putting to death of Jesus. Paul lived a crucified life. He always realized that every situation he was placed in was for him to die a little bit more, for his natural man, for his old self to die a little bit more, so that God could gain more ground in him. God could work himself more into him. And that's what we need today. We can talk about Zoom gloom. We can talk about mental health. And these things are very, very real. Very, very real. We should never despise them or think lowly of them. These are very real things. But even in these midst, in all of these things that are happening to us, we can still be full of rejoicing. We can bear it in our bodies, of putting to death. This is a continual condition, our continual expectation that wherever we go through in this world that we're in today, there will be suffering. And so, like Paul, we are in an environment of suffering that kills our natural man, we don't like being stuck at home, being quarantined. We don't like doing classes over Zoom virtually. But this is the current situation that we're in. And this shows us that we need to respond in a way that matches God's purpose. And so, just to give you an example of daily suffering, right? I've had this happen to me so many times. Your friends, your companions, your family, right? When you are growing up in such a way where you act like this, you speak like this, you talk like this, and you do things like this, it's gotten you where you are. But instead, when you try that thing with your companions, with your roommates, and even that you'll know your spouse, it doesn't work out. You realize how you grew up, all these things that you held on to, your righteousness, the way you do things, it just offends people. It makes them sad, you make them cry, and you have to realize, if it ain't God, it ain't good enough. Right? All these things that you hold on to, you think they are blessings to you, they are helpful to you, they're helpful to God. And instead you realize, these things that I've been holding on to, all they do is hurt my friends. hurt my companions, hurt my spouse. And you gotta let it go. You realize these things that I once wanted and longed for and that I want to keep for the rest of my life, they're good for nothing. If it ain't God, it ain't good enough. And I like to end with two more things. There's things that happen with Job and things that happen with Paul that are kind of similar. They're both surrounded by people. But Job has three friends that just complain, just refute Job, that don't really know what's going on, and they're just trying to tell Job their thoughts, their mind, whatever their opinions are. That's not good. But with Paul, we see in Philippians 1:19, he says, "For me this will turn out to salvation through your petition." Through your petition. He realized he still needed the supply of the saints through your petition. Through your petition. It's hard sometimes. We can talk about these three responses, right? Coming into our spirit to contact the Lord, rejoicing, and always bearing about in the body, the putting to death of Jesus. But it's hard. Truth be told, it's hard. When you don't know when things are up or down, left or right, you're flipped upside down, it's hard to get to your spirit. It's happened to me. I've been in situations where I didn't even know I was still saved. And I had to pull out a little gospel tract and read the prayer again just to realize I was saved again. And I still couldn't believe it. There are times in our life when it's impossible for us alone to get to our spirit. And that's why we need one another. Just look around you. Look around you right now. You'll see your companions. You'll see your fellow brothers and sisters. What you need from them is prayer. What you need from the mothers and fathers in the church is their prayer. When I was back in 2016, I went to Puerto Rico. Had an awesome time there. I hope y'all get a chance to go there one day. But I ended up sharing there one of my most heartbreaking experiences about what happened with me and my dad. We got into an argument, and it ended up being a really bad experience. And they ended up not talking to each other for 2.5 years. 2.5 years. I shared that experience. I was bawling. I was crying. I didn't know what had come out of it, but I found out 2 years later that a sister from Puerto Rico had been praying for me since that day. Since that day, another sister had relayed to me that she had asked the sister, how is Austin doing? How's he doing today? And she said, I've been praying for him ever since that day he opened up. Ever since that day. When I heard that from the sister that told me, I just broke down. I was like, I am not here. I am not here today because of what I've done, because of my heart for the Lord. I am here because I've been carried by the prayers of my mothers and fathers in the church. That's what we need today, brothers and sisters. When we're going through bouts of depression, mental health, Zoom gloom, all the things that are happening outwardly, family emergencies, family loss. The tendency is to shrink back, go away, go to your little hiding place, go back to your former way of living. But instead, we need to come forward, come to our mothers and fathers in the church and pray with them. And finally, we need to realize that in all this suffering, all the things that we go through, the God who allows these sufferings to us is the same God who became a man and died for us, who loved us so much and died for us. This is what constrains us to walk this way. This is how we realize we can no longer live to ourselves, but to Him. We realize that all things work together for good to those who love God. Brothers and sisters, we need to realize that loving Him, realizing that our God loves us and would love us to the point that He would die for us, is the one who's doing this today. That's the God who wants to gain more ground in our heart, wants to make more home in our heart. So in this year 2021, whatever may come, whatever may happen, may we all just learn to respond in a way that we open up and we pray, not just to the Lord, but with our companions, and allow God to gain more ground in our heart and make more home in our heart today. Thank you for coming, and thank you for coming to another week of Solid Ground.
Hey, we hope you've been enjoying our Solid Ground. And if you want more life, truth, and spirit-filled content, simply subscribe to our CSOC YouTube page right there, or download the link below, our CSOC app that will give you content daily and weekly in God's Word. So, we hope you can stay connected with us at Christian Students on Campus.